Hello everyone and welcome back to the Football Insider channel. Today we are talking about Newcastle United and what represents a good season for them. Of course, last season they finished in the top 5, got themselves a Champions League place and also won the Carabao Cup. It was an amazing season for Eddie Howe and all the Newcastle fans. But in the 25-26 season, what is the expectation at St James's Park? So we're going to dive into it in this video. Please let me know what you think of Newcastle United this season and what you think they should be looking to achieve. So let's start with the summer business, because we can't talk about the 25-26 season without getting a little bit of context, and the context of Newcastle's summer is basically two things. Number one, they spent a ton of money on new signings, but number two, they lost their best player in Alexander Isak, and we don't know how that is going to play out. Isak, of course, it wasn't necessarily the heartbeat of that Newcastle team, but he was a vital component, certainly, of their attack, and at times last season, because of the injuries to Callum Wilson and their lack of depth in the final third, Alexander Isak was basically Newcastle's, threat for goals. And he brought other players in, of course, but he was the main man, the talisman for Newcastle. He, of course, left this summer in a very public dispute almost with Newcastle United. It was a crazy situation where, he was writing statements publicly on his Instagram. Newcastle were determined not to sell. In the end, the best thing probably happened for all parties. Isak got his move. Newcastle got an absolute ton of money, and Liverpool, of course, got a very, very good player. But has it made Newcastle weaker? And I think in terms of their attack, undoubtedly the answer to that question is yes. But overall, their squad probably looks better balanced now after the summer. They brought in Elanga, they brought in Thiaw, they brought in Ramsey, they brought in Wissa, they brought in Woltemade. So they've added in a lot of quality. They spent a lot of money in the process. And in terms of outgoings, yes, they lost Isak, they lost Sean Longstaff as well. They lost little bits and pieces around the team. But overall, it does feel like Newcastle have upgraded in a lot of positions, even if they have potentially seen a rather significant downgrade through that striker position. And I think Newcastle's transfer window heading into the summer, their fans were thinking, right, we keep a hold of the players we've got. We didn't spend much in the last sort of 18 months in terms of transfers, so we've got a chance to really, really have a go, keep our best players, add a few in there, and really build this team forward. And I think that is probably the thing that has upset Newcastle fans the most, is that they felt like this was going to be a transformative summer. It might still be, but the fact that they lost a player like Isak and they had that disrupt their whole summer has probably soured what could have been a really impressive window for them. And in terms of their start to the Premier League season so far, it has been pretty underwhelming. 3 0-0 draws. They lost at home against Liverpool. They're a pretty nuts game, to be fair. An entertaining one. They lost 3-2. And then they also beat Wolves at home. So it's been a pretty underwhelming start of the season. But we're only 5 games in. They have also got through the Carabao Cup. The Champions League they lost against Barcelona. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what are Newcastle's aims and expectations for this season? And I think that they'll look at this and think there is no reason why they can't get 5th place again. You would look at the Premier League and the way it is and say that Man City, Arsenal, Liverpool, and probably Chelsea are all a little bit ahead of Newcastle right now. But after that, it's really hard to pick who the 5th best team in the Premier League. Do you look at Tottenham? Well, they finished 17th last season, so to say that they could finish 5th ahead of Newcastle seems a bit much, especially since they've got Champions League football as well. Then you've got Aston Villa, who've had a stinking start of the Premier League season. So of them three, you'd say Newcastle are possibly in the best position. Then you've got teams that could be, sort of punching up. Could Bournemouth potentially represent a major threat to that? Could they get into the 5th place? Brighton were maybe one before the start of the season, but they've had a pretty poor start. But could they push in and maybe get into 5th place? There's maybe a few others who've got their eye on it. But overall, it does feel like that position's pretty wide open. So I think Newcastle United, their expectation and their almost bare minimum for the season, even if they got knocked out of everything, has to be to try and get that 5th place, because Champions League football 2 years in a row would be very significant for them, would give them a real big building block. You'll get like almost £100 million for getting into the Champions League. So having that happen season after season, you then begin to be able to start competing really with the top end Premier League teams and their budgets. It would be a significant boost for Newcastle if they could get in the top 5 this season. And of course, also that UEFA coefficient, which meant we got 5 places last season in England. We need to hope that our progress in Europe is as good as last season. We see teams competing until the end of the trophies to see if we can get that 5th place, because otherwise it'll just be the top 4 again. And let's talk about the Champions League. What are Newcastle's expectations in that competition? And when they were in there a couple of years ago, they fell out in last place in their group. They were unlucky, to be fair. They had some decisions go against them, but they didn't, at that time, you could finish 3rd and get in the Europa League. They didn't manage to do that. So last time in the Champions League was pretty disappointing for them. Had some really high moments, but overall didn't work out for them. Now, though, it's really hard actually to not get through the Champions League, because 24 teams out of the 36 make it through to the next part of the competition. 16 of those go into like an initial playoff, and the top 8 make it through automatically to the last 16. So the bare minimum, really, in my opinion, for Newcastle should be to get into that playoff round. They should be targeting getting into the last 16 overall, whether or not it's finishing in the top 8 or going through a playoff round. But I think that has to be Newcastle's aim this season in the Champions League. They probably would have to win 4 of their games to do that. That means they'll have to win at least 1 game on the road. I think it'd be really disappointing for a club of their resource, an English Premier League club, to see them not, get through at least to that playoff round. And if they didn't do that, that would be very, very disappointing for them in the competition. So I think Newcastle, it should be finishing in that top 24 and then winning the first playoff round to get into the last 16. That, for me, would be the target and the expectation for Newcastle this season, and their bare minimum expectation for the Champions League. Not that I think Eddie Howe's future would rely on that. Don't think they would sack him, but I think it would put a little bit of pressure on him if they were to fall out the Champions League in disappointing fashion. Let's now talk about the domestic trophies, because Newcastle won the Carabao Cup last season, and because of that, I think it's fair to say that Newcastle fans think they should be competing for trophies more. That is something that I think Eddie Howe will also target. Like, how do you make memories as a football manager and a football fan? You want to win trophies, and Newcastle have the squad depth to be able to challenge on all fronts. They've already made it through their first Carabao Cup game, and they will be looking to retain that trophy this season. I've got no doubt about it. The FA Cup as well represents another chance for them to win a competition. Now, I don't think that at the start of the season, one of the main things for Eddie Howe would be, right, let's win another trophy this season. But I certainly think they'll be taking them very seriously, as Newcastle have largely under Eddie Howe since he's been manager. So I'm not saying that, again, the expectation is that Newcastle should win a trophy this season, but I think their fans will be hoping that they can have deep cup runs in at least one of those competitions, and winning trophies breeds success and all that good stuff for Newcastle. So, in my opinion, the domestic trophies, you want to be trying to reach at least a semi-final in one of them. But again, I don't think Eddie Howe is going to be judged too harshly on that after he won the Carabao Cup last season. So it's all well and good, though, talking about expectations and whatnot, but are there any concerns? And I think that, there has to be a few with Newcastle this season. They've started the season not that well. It doesn't look like their forward line is really clicking very well at the moment. They are struggling to score goals. They've had a disappointing start of the season in the Premier League. And, it's whether or not that forward line can click and Woltemade can really hit the ground running. Obviously, they brought in Wissa, and he's picked up an injury, which is a massive blow for them. But yeah, it's not been a great start, and it feels like in these early stages of the season, we could be looking at a year of transition, which is probably born out of the Alexander Isak situation. Newcastle were dealt a massive blow there. They were trying to keep hold of him, and losing him and having that disrupt their whole summer probably means that it's going to be difficult for Eddie Howe to get this team hitting the ground running, certainly in the early stages of the season. And because of that, it means that them challenging to get maybe into the top 4 feels unlikely right now. So the concerns are mainly that I don't trust that this team's going to click straight away. And I think there are issues within this team right now which stem largely from their transfer business being a little bit staggered. They probably need to get some players through the door earlier in the window than what they did. And also you had the upheaval of the Alexander Isak situation. So what is the verdict for Newcastle and their season ahead? And I think Newcastle's next 2 home games are crucial. They play Arsenal and Nottingham Forest at St James's Park before the international break. And they will be looking to pick up 6 points there. And look, Arsenal are obviously a fantastic team, but they struggle going to St James's Park. Newcastle, I think, beat them 3 times last season in all competitions. So Mikel Arteta's team won't fancy that one. And then Nottingham Forest at home, they are games that Newcastle should be winning. So if they can pick up the 6 points there, that really starts giving them a platform to build for the second half of the season. If they struggle in these 2 games, maybe only pick up 1 point or just a win against Forest and lose the Arsenal game, then maybe questions will start to arise as to whether or not you know, this Newcastle team can achieve the success that they managed last season. But with Champions League, Carabao Cup and all that good stuff happening for them, it's going to be a lot of games for Newcastle United to figure it out and see what's going to happen. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Newcastle this season. Thanks everyone for watching this video, and we'll catch you for another one very soon.